So I'm assuming some of you are familiar with the Lethal Weapon movies. Action movies with Mel Gibson, Danny Glover, allegedly popularized the whole buddy cop genre, even though it wasn't the first to do it. Yeah, so those movies are fun little flicks and they made money. And naturally you know the deal. When something makes money, we need to turn it into a bunch of shitty video games, and here's one of them. Lethal Weapon, released in 1993 for the Game Boy, courtesy of Ocean and Eurocom, and this is more or less a port of the NES version. Basically a side-scrolling beat-em-up where you play as Sergeant Martin Riggs or Sergeant Roger Murtaugh, and you play through a number of levels presumably based on settings from the Lethal Weapon trilogy of the time, because number 4 didn't come out until '98. So it's a single-player game, which is understandable because it's Game Boy, but it was a point of criticism on the NES. And like I said, it's a beat-em-up. You start off with Riggs, but you walk off to the left side of the screen to switch to Murtaugh. And the neat thing about this mechanic is that the inactive player slowly recovers health over time. So if Murtaugh, who's too old for this shit, is taking a pounding, he can tag out, Riggs can take over, and then after a while you can tag Murtaugh back in, and he'll be relatively healthy. It's almost reminiscent of the tag mechanic from the Marvel vs. Capcom games, and that's a comparison that I'm sure many have made when talking about this fine video game here. Okay, back to the gameplay. There are differences between the two. Riggs has a weak high kick but he could jump high, while Murtaugh punches real hard and does more damage but is not quite as agile. Both can use melee attacks or they could pull out a gun for long-ranged attacks, which isn't quite as useful as you'd think because it takes multiple hits to kill a crook and you have limited ammo, and so it gets to a point where other than a couple points here and there, the gun's practically useless. You may as well be armed with a rubber plant. Nobody is going to get that unless they're too old for this shit. So we all know the common ailment with beat-em-ups. It's a lot of stop, beat up a bunch of mooks, go, lather, rinse, repeat. This style of play is generally repetitive fare, usually offset with fun gameplay or a decent multiplayer experience as it relates to some of the genre's best examples. Lethal Weapon has neither of these things. The lack of multiplayer on Game Boy? Fine, I'll give it a pass. And I'll admit at first I didn't mind the gameplay all that much. Kinda bullshit they gave me a gun and it's more of a loaded weapon than a lethal one, but whatever, it's something I guess. And it wasn't long though before I realized how bored I was with this game. And it's not for a lack of trying either. The Game Boy version only has like 5 or 6 stages, which is significantly less than the NES version I think. And yet somehow every stage starts to feel the same. They feel like they drag on for far too long, and honestly, I was struggling not to conquer the game's challenge, mind you, but rather to stay interested or engaged. I might have an easier time trying to explain what closed as a lingerie shop without a front window means than trying to stay awake playing through this game. Anyway, you only have 2 lives represented by the 2 cops, and if one bites the dust, you're stuck with the other, and if both go out, it's game over with only one continuing stock. Control is functional at best, not much more than that. Collision detection tends to be a bit spotty and precise, I guess, but otherwise no real issues other than the dumb fucks in the holes out of reach for most of my attacks, so I'm left doing the wacky jump kick move that only hits half the time. Yay! God damn it. The graphics aren't too bad, I don't think. The sprites are fairly big, our heroes look like who they're supposed to look like, and the rest of the grunts are just there. The scenery looks alright, if not a bit samey at times. Of course there's screen crunch since everything is so big, and this is based on an NES game, but it's not that big of a deal. The only time it's an issue is when you need to jump over pits on occasion, but that's about it. Not an amazing looking game, but more than adequate for typical licensed dodge. Sound is a mixed bag though. Look, anyone expecting Game Boy chip music to measure up to Lethal Weapon sax solos and guitar riffs needs to go spit, okay? That's never gonna happen. What's here, however, is, Music sounds like a lot of stock music stuff you hear in a bunch of Ocean games. You could pretty much slap it anywhere, and it looks like they did, quite frankly. Sound effects are kinda there, not much else to say. Overall, Lethal Weapon on Game Boy isn't terrible. I've certainly played worse beat-em-up games, but it is very boring. It's got a couple bits I like, but the rest of the game is pretty much a sloth. Very dull, very tedious, not very enjoyable, and not a single toilet bomb to be found anywhere. So, yeah, just stick with the movies and leave this be. Oh, and grab the cat. told you to grab the damn cat, for fuck's sake.